When it comes to lots of different issues, there is one thing that they all have in common. Every state in the country, regardless of whether you have a new government, an old government, a Liberal government or a Labor government, ramping is a massive issue. It means that when you call 000, you may or may not get an ambulance on time. Why? Because they may or may not be waiting in a queue in a hospital. Why? Because there may or may not be a bed for the person who's in the back of the ambulance, meaning that when you call 000, sometimes it can be a deadly scenario where one is not turning up. For families, the number of people they have to compete with to hold on to a rental property is more than ever before. Firstly, because there's more people here than ever before. Secondly, because there's fewer rental properties around than ever before, which means, of course, that many people are starting now to live on the fringes, and despite the fact that they earn money, despite the fact that they should be in a home, they are not. The place they call home is a tent. And as I've spoken about almost every night for the past couple of years, but we speak about it with regularity because I know you care about it, no matter what the rest of the media thinks is the story of the day, it is the question of immigration. Now, for those who are, again, maybe joining us for the first time because of the documentary, when I talk about immigration, I do not care from whence people come. I do not care from what language they speak, and I do not care what God they believe in. I believe that regardless of where you come from in the world, that you should unite around the sensible principles and central principles of this country. One where there is a freedom of expression, one where there is a fundamental respect for all genders, where there is the capacity for people to marry a person of their same sex, for someone to be able to follow a religion or not have a religion at all, and most importantly, for the law of the land to be the ultimate authority of behaviour. But that's not what I talk about when I talk about immigration on this program. It's not about the cultural mix or the cultural changes. Others can talk about that. The point is that Australia has 27 million people right now, but we do not have the infrastructure that can handle 27 million people. For example, is there places to live, or are there enough ambulances, let alone places in schools and all the rest of it? Well, new report confirms what we have known all along. The majority of Australians think that this government has brought too many people into the country too quickly. In fact, according to this report, almost half of Australians believe that migration is too high. Of the more than 8,000 people who were surveyed, 49% believed that immigration levels were too high. Now, this is a major change from just last year, when 33 people agreed with the view that there was too much immigration. To give you an idea of how this has changed over time, have a look at this. Now, again, from this group that did the survey, the blue line is the number of people who think that migration is too high. The last time that more people thought that it was too high than about right, you have to go back to 2018. You can see the changes post-pandemic at 24%, 33% in 2023, and now 49%. 51% of people last year thought that we were about right. Now, after more than 1 million people have come in under the Albanese government's watch, the about right number has fallen to 40. 22% of people 2 years ago said that we had too few people come into the country. That is now just 9%. But despite the fact that the majority of Australians, while completely understanding that we are a country of migrants, want to pump the brakes about the number of people who are being brought in to add to a multiplicity of problems that this government is not willing to fix, what do you think the government asked itself today in question time? Well, nothing about that, of course.
My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Women. How are the Albanese Labor government's policies and reforms helping to close the gender pay gap and supporting women's economic security and equality?
My question is to the Minister for Industry and Science. Why is today's announcement of the first investments for the National Reconstruction Fund for Australian manufacturing and Australian jobs so important? And what risks are there to the future of these jobs?
My question is to the Treasurer. Why is decent pay such an important part of the Albanese Labor government's efforts to help ease cost of living pressures? How does this approach differ from what has failed in the past?
My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. How is the Albanese Labor government strengthening our international trade relationships to benefit Australian farmers?
Not to mention, of course, the fact that, as we told you last night, 3 million people are close to homelessness. The Reserve Bank today has turned around and said that you can forget about the idea of an early interest rate cut. Most likely the first one will be in May, right on top of the federal election. My view is that even one reduction in interest rates is not going to make people forget the 12 increases that have happened under this government. Which is why the Prime Minister needs to get back here. I get it, he's a global leader, and it's very important to hold hands with a lame duck president or Justin Trudeau on his way out the door as the Canadian Prime Minister. But of course he was there holding hands with the Chinese today, the handsome boy and the puppet master, saying that Australia was a perfect example of the way that nations should deal with China, which of course in the Albanese language just means sit back and take it. But of course something that's been hurting the Prime Minister has been this attitude and this idea that basically life's pretty good for this bloke. So much so that he even asks for upgrades when he's flying family trips. Upgrade elbow is starting to hurt him. I say this because there was an opinion poll where the headline was all about Qantas and Qantas getting preferential treatment, hence the upgrades, but the real detail followed deeper into the article. The Redbridge research puts the Labor and Coalition at 50-50 on a two-party election. Inflation and the rising cost of living, as well as other grievances, are pushing the federal government into a place where they could lose the election. The polling found that 56% of people who are planning to vote for Labor are not fully committed. It, put simply, is a soft vote, potentially up for grabs by an opposing party, compared to just 31% of people planning to vote for the Coalition, or half of the people who are planning to vote for the Greens. So more people, if they say they're going to vote Coalition, are more committed to voting Coalition rather than Labor or the Greens. The research also found that 51% of voters believed that their future living standards would be worse or much worse in 5 years. This is compared to the period before the 2020 pandemic. All is not well in Australia, and we have a government that is telling you things are way better than they actually are. I repeat, you have just seen tonight and been educated, if you weren't already across the detail, about the fantasy when it comes to changing from one sort of an electricity grid to another, that actually costs a lot more money than anyone was ever willing to tell you. And the reality is that it costs hundreds of billions of dollars to actually build this stuff, meaning that you end up having to pay ultimately as a customer. We're in a scenario now where this government took away from 10 million workers in the 2023 budget an automatic $1,500 tax return. You would imagine that people like the aged pensioner and 10 million other people would much prefer $1,500 than just pats on the back coming from Canberra.